All right, in part one, we looked at Napoleon's rise to power and especially his domestic policies. Now, what we're going to look at is his international policies, and that's why it's important to look at a map like this that really sort of lays out Napoleon's conquests so you can get a sense of just how much territory Napoleon was in charge of. So you can see France in the darker green there, mostly in the center of the map, and it includes not just France, but sections that go into Italy as well as up into Holland as well. Then you'll also notice that there are French allies. So you'll have allies such as the Kingdom of Norway and Denmark. You'll have the Austrian Empire as well. I should point out that not all of them were initially allies. Some of them had issues with Napoleon. The Confederacy of the Rhine and the Swiss Confederation, the Kingdom of Italy, as well as the Kingdom of Spain and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. All of those are actually satellite states, which I will explain in a minute. The bottom line is that when you look at France at the height of Napoleon's empire in 1812, what you see here is that he basically controls most of the European continent. The only ones that are really outside of that are Portugal, the Great Britain, Sweden, and Russia. But in terms of pretty much all of Western and Central and even into parts of Southern Europe, Napoleon is in charge of all of this. So he has a massive empire, which may be one of the reasons why he thought it would be a good idea to invade Russia. So in terms of Napoleon's rule during this period and his 10-year empire, it's important to note that obviously warfare is an incredibly important aspect of that. Now, he was so successful because he had made a lot of improvements to the army. He improved morale, he cultivated loyalty to himself, he used the army as a tool of social mobility for people, so it benefited people to fight well. And it's important to note, too, that most of Europe opposed Napoleon's policies of expansion, but many of them had no choice once he invaded. So the bottom line is that Napoleon and the French are constantly fighting offensive wars to gain more territories. And ultimately, they'll be opposed by a lot of coalitions, but it will take some time for those to come through. Now, in terms of how they rule, it's important to note that they have satellite states, the French. That is, what they would do is they would divide up conquered lands among essentially his own family to rule. So either Napoleon or members of his family controlled most of those territories that you saw, from Spain to Germany to Austria. And in these areas, though, he did spread sort of, Enlightenment and French governmental ideas, but a lot of these places really, really had some issues with their loss of independence, naturally speaking. Now, he also set up this thing known as the continental system because he was controlling this entire territory. Basically, in the West, the only power left to oppose France was Great Britain. Napoleon could not compete with the British Navy, and in fact, he had had a terrible defeat at Trafalgar by the British Navy, where the British essentially asserted total dominance and control. So Napoleon's plan then, and what you kind of see on this map here, his plan was to, beginning in late '05 and beginning into 1806, was to close all ports in continental Europe behind that dashed red line to British goods. And his plan was that he would damage the British economy and he would spark a rebellion. Unfortunately, it didn't work because England could still trade with basically everybody else in the world. So the Americas, the Mediterranean, and this hurt Europe more than anything else and more than it hurt England. And he also refused to compensate a lot of these countries for the loss of their trade. And he didn't allow any free trade within the continent. He continued to impose tariffs that favored France alone at the expense of even his other allies. This led a lot of other countries to bypass this continental system, which actually lent itself to a lot of smuggling of English goods. There was a lot of piracy going on, and of course, England had no problem with that. This gives you a bigger sense of just the entire area that Napoleon tried to cordon off from the British there, so they could not trade in Europe itself. Ultimately, it was unsuccessful. It actually damaged the economies of Europe more than anything. So, let's look at then, we've seen some of Napoleon's successes, but let's look at his downfall. And then there's two sort of areas where we see a lot of opposition to Napoleon: Spain and Russia. He ends up fighting a whole series of wars elsewhere as well. So Spain, particularly beginning in 1807, he ends up invading there. And initially, Spain is actually his ally at first against Portugal, but ultimately he simply takes over Spain as well, which creates a lot of animosity among the Spaniards. And French control of Spain is very brutal and really sort of imposes a harsh rule on the Spanish. And so one of the things that a lot of the Spanish end up doing is banding together and fighting an asymmetrical battle against the French. What that means is basically they fight guerrilla warfare. And what that means is you have a lot of small groups of Spaniards who are not very heavily armed, but they have to do things like ambushes and so forth to stop the French army. The French response to this was fairly outrageous by any standard at the time, and definitely did even more to galvanize the Spanish against the French. If you look at this picture by Francisco Goya, the 3rd of May, 1808, this is a very, very sort of emotional and evocative image that's very indicative of sort of this French-Spanish divide. So here what you see is you see a series of civilians who are brought out behind a hill where apparently they're standing in front of a firing squad of French soldiers. And notice the distinction. First of all, there are several dead ones on the ground already. It looks like there is a monk or a priest who is also about to be shot. None of these individuals look to be all that wealthy. You have some women who are sort of there. You can see a woman who's wearing sort of a white shawl on her head. These all seem to be relatively poor, or at least not high-class individuals here. They're not entirely wealthy, but they're supposed to be indicative of Spain. And opposed to them, you have these faceless, mechanized, brutal soldiers who are pulling these people out behind a hill and executing them. And a couple things to notice about the picture too is that your eyes are drawn to the individual who is in the center of the picture there, who is wearing white, either for innocence and or purity. But also notice the way that his arms are sort of held out there. He is kind of the sacrificial victim of the French. And it very much, for a very deeply Catholic society, this sort of image here would really call to mind an image of a crucifix, so a crucified Jesus. So this individual here is some sort of martyr for the Spanish cause. The other thing to notice too is that they're not being executed in the town, which you can see behind them there. They're being executed behind some hill, and they're also not being killed in the daytime. They've been taken away at night. So this entire image is obviously very much in favor of the guerrillas. It's very much in favor of these insurgents here and not the French. And this image is something that really kind of, even though it comes out later, is something that really encapsulates the Spanish opposition to the French occupation, because they really are made out to be monsters there. Another example of Napoleon's downfall, in addition to Spain, was probably his biggest mistake, which was his invasion of Russia, beginning in 1812. This was a terrible, terrible undertaking by Napoleon, and as you probably know from your reading or from just a general understanding of Napoleon, he failed miserably. He began the invasion in the mid to late summer of 1812, and by December, most of his army was destroyed. His plan was, originally he'd actually made an alliance and a treaty with Russia back in 1807, the Treaty of Tilsit, where they were going to be allies. But he then decided that he would open up a new front, because he wasn't fighting enough people in Europe, and invade. So he set out with what he thought was sufficient number of troops, 685,000 troops. He comes back with only about 110,000. So in terms of total deaths, it appears that he lost close to 400,000 soldiers in the invasion of Russia. And you can see that depicted here in the image. This is Napoleon returning in defeat from Russia. And of course, those are all of his soldiers, many of whom have fallen on the ground and frozen. He didn't really count on how long it would take him to go from the west to Moscow, nor did he count on the brutal, apparently even more brutal than normal, winter that took place. It's best to look at this actually in graph format. And Charles Minard, in 1869, created what's called the figurative chart of the French army on their campaign into Russia. And what this chart shows you at the top there is the beige color shows this is both a graphic showing you distance and amount of people who are part of the part of the army. So it starts off on the left side very thick because that's the thickness of the line represents the number of men. And it progresses spatially into Russia, and you can see Moscow is listed up in the top right corner there. But the closer they get to Moscow, there are a series of fights. The closer they get, the more men they lose, and then ultimately they're unsuccessful and they have to turn around and retreat, and that's what the black line is. The black line is the retreat, and you notice that even in its comparison to the beginning of the retreat, it very immediately ends up getting smaller and smaller and smaller until very few come back underneath the beige itself. Now, the other thing to note about why this is so significant and why this happened is if you look at the bottom of the chart, and it's kind of hard to see, so if you go to, say, Wikipedia and open up this map or this chart, you'll see it a little bit better. But the chart at the bottom down there, that graph, actually goes, it starts on the right side and goes to the left. So the first point there, what this is doing is it's showing you the temperature in Russia at the time in degrees Celsius, and the zero line is actually the top line. So what this means is that is freezing, and everything below that is significantly lower than freezing. So by the time that they are almost back to France, they've basically frozen to death. This image actually is a better one. This is an overlay from a Google map where you can see sort of using the same lines. You can see where the army starts in Western Europe and marches all the way over to Moscow, turns, and then ends up coming back. And this one actually, you can see the dates at the bottom on this one as well. So when they leave on 18th of October, it's already 0 degrees, so it's freezing. The next week or so, it's still freezing, and then it's 10 degrees below, 20 degrees below, 30 degrees below by December. And this is one of the reasons why, in addition to their casualties that they suffer at the hands of the Russians, they also lose something like 380,000 men, in addition to a lot of others who die, not just in battle, but especially because of starvation and because of freezing. So what does that mean? Well, after Spain and Russia, in 1814, his invasion of Russia began in 1812, but by 1814, Napoleon is ultimately deposed. He is kicked out, and the French Senate in 1814 deposes him, and he then is sent or flees to the island of Elba, which is off the Italian coast. And interestingly enough, there's actually a king who's put in charge. So he's deposed in 1814. Meanwhile, there is a Congress of Vienna that comes together, this meeting of Austria, Russia, Prussia, Britain, and France, without Napoleon, while Napoleon is in his first exile. And the goal of this was for a balance of power in Europe so that no one state could ever get too powerful again. All French territories had to be returned. It's a very sort of conservative Congress because it puts traditional rulers back in place, and you can read more about the Congress of Vienna in your textbook. And the idea was that they all agreed that they would have peace for at least 20 years. So the Congress of Vienna is trying to remake Europe after the debacle that is Napoleon. Although Napoleon, while he's on Elba, regroups, and because the now King of France, Louis, is caught between various factions, Napoleon takes advantage of this and essentially tries to gather up a popular army, comes back to France in 1815. A lot of people cheer his return, many of whom obviously did not go to Russia with him. He puts together another army. He marches on Belgium, but he only lasts 100 days. This is known as Napoleon's 100 days, where ultimately he is defeated at Waterloo on June 18th, 1815, by a coalition of basically all of Europe. So it's Napoleon versus all of Europe. And he's banished again, this time to the island of St. Helena, which is off the coast of West Africa, where he will remain until he dies May 5th, 1821. So this map should give you a sense of just how far away St. Helena is from the rest of Europe. At the top you can see where he had been on Elba. Actually, that doesn't exactly point to it, but right near there. Little tiny, you can't even see it on this scale of the map, which wasn't too far for him to get from there to the rest of Europe. But if you look then down below, you will see St. Helena far, far off in the deep South Atlantic Ocean, which on this map, and this map doesn't have a scale, he is well over 1,000 miles. Actually, it's probably closer to 1,500 to 1,700 miles at least from the nearest land, which is in South Central Africa. So the idea was that Napoleon is banished as far away as possible from everyone, so he will never ever return to take over stuff again. That's exactly how bad the Europeans hated him and wanted him out of the picture. So that's where Napoleon is sent. Ultimately, his life ends in failure and in solitude, far away in the South Atlantic. And as your book points out, in terms of legacy, Napoleon is also responsible for causing a sense of nationalism in people who were conquered, in return of monarchies and conservatism, as well as international law. So look to your Hunt textbook for more explanations of that.